kind of like failed a lot there, and kind of failed upwards a little bit.
What was it that first interested you in acting and, brought you to the theatre?
I kind of didn't grow up going to the theatre, actually. I probably didn't see a play for the first time till I was about 17 years old. That was just because that wasn't something that like my friends did or my family did. I kind of grew up in East London, but there wasn't really a theatre that was that close to me. But I went to the National Youth Theatre because I knew someone who was going there. And that was the first time that I was surrounded by people who were interested in these things called plays, or were interested in dissecting films or talking about actors and what their journeys had been through and how you can become an actor and learn about acting. And then I ended up going to drum school. I went to Guildhall School of Music and Drama when I was 18, and kind of like failed a lot there, and kind of failed upwards a little bit. And kind of started off working in theatre mostly, and then moved on to screen projects later on in my career.
How would you describe your first experience on stage?
My first experience on stage was kind of underwhelming in some ways. I was playing a postman in a musical version of Pygmalion called Me and My Girl, and had loads of like Cockney like singing songs, and I'm a terrible singer, so that was disappointing for both me and the audience. But I was playing postman in it and had like a couple of like funny little lines and a fun little scene that like got some laughs from people who were in my school, so suddenly like my kind of social status kind of rose a little bit, so it was that was exciting and thrilling, so I've kind of like tried to recreate that feeling of newness and spontaneity in a lot of the things I've done since.
Obviously, you gained critical acclaim for your role in I May Destroy You, which you worked on with your friend and fellow Guildhall alum Michaela Cole. And I wondered, how did you two first meet, and how did that kind of working relationship begin?
Yeah, we met at Guildhall. We kind of met on the first day when we all got... Weirdly, at that school, they tell you whether you got in or not all on the same day in front of everybody. So it's a little bit like X Factor in that sense. But we met on that day, and she kind of went to school not far from where I grew up. We're both from East London, and so spent 3 years kind of working. That was our working relationship. 3 years kind of like devising and, like I say, failing together, and playing together, but like mostly like building a friendship. And our kind of like working relationship through I May Destroy You came through quite a roundabout way. The part was never written for me or with me in mind or whatever, but somehow we kind of came together. But when we started working together, I guess because there's that kind of like it pre-existing love and respect and understanding, it was just very easy and fruitful and lovely. And I feel very grateful for having had that opportunity.
Such a great show.
Thank you.
And I wanted to ask, is there any role that you've played that you would approach differently now?
Every single one. It's like every single time like I go back and watch anything, I'm like, oh God, I should have done it like that, and or like I thought I was doing like that and it came out like this. So every single one, but like not in a way that means that I would actually go back and change it. But with everything, I'm a bit of a perfectionist and always strive for everything to be the very best version that it can be. And so we'll never like look back and think, that was perfect, So every single one.
I wonder, what were the movies that you loved growing up, and do you remember your first cinema trip at all?
My first cinema trip was to see the Flintstones movie with like John Goodman and some other people. I don't know who else was in that movie, but it was the Flintstones, and they weren't a cartoon, they were real people. It was crazy. I remember seeing that when I was maybe like 4 or 5 years old. I remember seeing Batman, the Batman with George Clooney. I can't remember if that's called Batman Forever or Batman and Robin, in my local cinema, which was very exciting. But my favourite films when I was young, I used to love like the Rush Hour films with Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan, because I just thought they had amazing chemistry and they were really funny, and I loved seeing the physicality of the actors. I loved kind of like anything that Denzel Washington was in, or anything that Will Smith was in, or Jamie Foxx was in, you know. So I was a real kind of like lover of seeing people who kind of look like me or look like my family on screen, but being brilliant and being on big posters and all of that.
And what were the TV obsessions you had growing up?
When I was growing up, I loved The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, going back to Will Smith. I still actually love that show. I think it's like astonishingly brilliant. I think it's so well written, so charismatically performed. I hate to say it, but I think it's probably the best thing that Will's ever done. And I'm a big Will Smith fan, so that just shows how high esteem I hold that show. I loved that. I'm trying to think of like British shows that my mum used to really love. Only Fools and Horses. So we had like all the DVDs of that, and I've probably seen every single one of that. So that's a real old school like English British like comedy. David Jason, all that. I actually quite liked like quite a lot of that old school stuff. I liked like Fawlty Towers and like the Two Ronnies and you know, Porridge and Open All Hours, all of that stuff. Like we were really into that stuff, which now thinking about it feels like a little bit surprising, but I think that was probably like where I started off before moving on to other things.
Is there any role that you went for and didn't get that you regretted missing out on?
Why are you trying to dredge up my trauma again? Any roles? Yes, yeah, obviously loads. Like every single one. But I remember like I auditioned to be in this play with Chiwetel Ejiofor. It was called Season in the Congo. It was maybe, I can't remember how long, it was maybe 8 years ago. And I was doing a play at the time, and I had to like travel from Bristol to be in London at like 9 a.m. So I got this, and I was broke. So I got this coach that left Bristol at like 4:30 a.m. or whatever. I was knackered. And so I was like, let me have a coffee to wake myself up. And at these times I didn't really drink coffee. So I just like double espresso, which like sent my brain insane. I like lost my mind. And so obviously went into this audition like completely wired, like losing it. Messed up the audition, didn't get it. I think I ended up going to Daniel Kaluuya, to be honest, so I'm sure it wouldn't have made a difference otherwise. But like he was Chiwetel was, again, like he was someone that was one of the reasons I became an actor, and someone I looked up to so much, and I wanted it so bad. I was so kind of like hold on tightly about it that there was no relaxation, there was no ability for me to just like show myself, you know, and that was the thing that they're looking for, you know. So that was, whilst it was, that one really hit hard, it was a really valuable lesson to me to like, you know what, sometimes don't think too much about how much you want it, just like think about how to share yourself with the person that you're working with, because those auditions are opportunities to work with somebody as opposed to prove yourself to someone. You
kind of touched on this earlier, but I wondered, you know, what was the first show or film that you saw that you felt like you saw yourself represented on screen?
Yeah, I mean, I watched a lot of those kind of films when I was young, you know, and and I suppose like representation doesn't just go, it goes further than like, you know, my gender or my race or whatever. So like I could find myself represent, like in my head, I always thought I was going to be in Harry Potter. Do you know what I mean? Like when I was reading those books, I was like, I'm in, what was it, Gryffindor or whatever. Like, so I could feel versions of myself represented in that film, even though people didn't necessarily look like me. But yeah, like I've spoken before about Lenny James and seen him in a show called in a television film called Fallout, which I just loved, and not even necessarily, like, I mean, there was a part of it that kind of represented the kind of circumstances that I grew up in, but there was something about his performance and Emil Mean's performance in that show that, really made me think about acting in a slightly different way.
And you may think this is me going back to your trauma again, but I wondered, what was the first film to make you cry?
First film to make me cry? Wow. I cried a lot in The Lion King, you know. Lion King was really probably my favourite film, actually, it probably still is, to be honest. The old school Lion King, not the new one. But when no spoilers, but when whatever happens to Mufasa happens to Mufasa, like that was a hard one for me to take as a youth. So I cried a lot in that. And I also really remember, did you ever see the film Beast of the Southern Wild?
Yes.
Amazing film. I saw it with a live orchestra once, and the music in that film was just like so moving. But like that, I remember that broke me in half as well. But I was a bit older by then. It's okay to cry though.
Were there any mentors in your life or career that had a defining impact on you, or who has set you on your path for acting?
Lots of mentors. Like, I suppose like my first drama teacher at school, who's called Mr. Oliver, was the first person to say like, you're good at this, you know, or like you might be good at this, so maybe you should try doing it, try learning more about it, you know. So I've got to shout him out. But like every step of the way, you know, my teachers when I was at Guildhall, or you know, actors that I've worked with since, like even like I just did a play with Cobner Holbrook Smith, who's now mainly a friend, you know, but has always been like incredibly, he's just like probably the most intelligent person I know, but he's always been incredibly like forthcoming with advice and mentorship towards me, even when we weren't friends, you know. So I feel like you can find mentorship in anybody, you know. It doesn't have to be someone who's, you know, 4-time Academy Award winner, you know. Like there's mentorship and advice and inspiration to be found from anyone. That's not to say that I don't think Cobner should be winning like Academy Awards, just for the record. In fact, he should be. So this is my campaign for him to win.
We'll get started. And I wondered if you could go back in time and give young Paapa any advice on how to change his origin story, what would it be?
I mean, like watching the Lazarus Project, you should be very, very careful with going back in time and meddling with anything. But I think, like, for if ever I was to go back in time and talk to myself, it would always to be kinder to myself, or to be as kind as possible to myself. You know, like we all like think like the immediate moment is so important and so high stakes and so full of jeopardy and danger, but and sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And in those moments, I think it's incredibly important to take time for yourself and be kind to yourself, to allow things to take the time that they need to you know, to progress in whichever way feels right. So that's what I would tell myself, my very anxious 20-whatever-year-old self.
Straight out Guildhall.
Yeah, exactly.